to the conference organizers and sponsors and my previous presenters. And I'll say a special thank you. It's a pleasure to thank Doug McCalla, whose patience and commitment as a scholar and advisor was really the principal reason I'm here and able to present this and to present new work today. And he can take credit for a lot of my successes and none of the mistakes. So I am also thankful for SSHRC with one direct funding for this through a postdoctoral fellowship, and then two sort of indirectly through partnership grants and knowledge clusters. So I think the panel has some similarities. We're all asking questions of what is a business, and I'm going to add how can a business manipulate its environment sustainably, and talk about some measures of sustainability. And in the program I might have included other balances or measures like nutrients in the case of agriculture, or information. And I'm not going to get to any of those. I'm just going to do energy. So I'll keep this energetic, and we'll finish strongly here with the last paper after lunch. So the first project that I did is a little bit different. I will mention it just briefly. Where's my advancer here? And it's still connected to my work in Canadian food and energy, but it was a project on flax. Doug McCalla mentioned the expert on flax was in the room. That was me. And the book that came out of the PhD dissertation is called Flax Americana, a history of the fiber and oil that covered a continent. And as I call it here, Canada's other oil. It didn't come up in Bill Waser's talk on the first session in the plenary because he's talking about the wheat economy. That's okay. He did mention canola, so that's the yellow crop you see there, of course. And flax is in the foreground, and the two are very connected. And part of the argument of that book is that some of these small mills that Professor McCalla has already mentioned in his talk were responsible for manipulating a very small fiber economy in Ontario. For over 100 years, it existed in these small mill towns, mostly in southwestern Ontario, manipulating the environment and the local labor supply, especially of First Nations laborers. They were, in many years, the primary workforce. And farmers found the crop too risky to grow, so millers had to do it themselves by organizing all of this. And then as soon as they realized that the fiber really wasn't much good for making fine linen in Canada, that industry never took off. They used it for coarse production, textiles, cordage, coarse textiles and cordage. And then they realized that the oil that was crushed out of the seed became much more important and helped launch, as the crop moved west and became essentially a pioneer crop, helped launch the oilseed empire of the West. Flax was more or less important for 50 or 60 years. If you want to read about that right away, you can read it in this year's edition of Business History, which has an article on the linseed oil industry and its relation to information. But apart from the flax you see in my jacket and on the screen, that's all you're going to see with flax today. I'm going to get onto the new work, which is energy, and keeping me involved in a couple different projects. A couple I'll be able to point to which are now published, but really they're going to be the second book. The second book project, which is an attempt to find an integrated and systems-based approach to energy in Canada, and specifically traditional energy carriers. So some people have written about the modern energy environment in Canada, but not much is known about what came before that, how Canadians stayed warm and fed for centuries without the use of fossil fuels or hydroelectricity. So I'm going to go through energy history really briefly and its importance. And I'm going to look specifically at one kind of energy in consumption and production, and then come back around to whether this is a business when we look at the farm level, because they're managing energy and concerned with things like energy efficiency and returns on investment. So energy history has become popular recently, and it goes back to Alfred Chandler and before, but Netshirt and Schur and others in the 1970s. Alfred Chandler's piece on coal was, I believe, 1972, but arguing that the transition to coal was the key moment in industrialization. Chandler made that argument first. It's been repeated several times since, including by Václav Smil, who's written other books on it, but the quote in this particular book on manufacturing is particularly poignant, that biomass, it's an epical transition. As biomass fuels, wood and charcoal, and animate energies, human and animal muscles, are displaced by fossil fuels. and electricity. And he's interested primarily in how they're used for manufacturing. But it's that transitional moment. So energy history is really about transitions, which goes back as early as Cesare Marchetti and others in the 1970s, the Odoms and Amory Lovins, others who are thinking about big energy systems and how they change. And Marchetti's got the back of the napkin diagram here in the 1970s, of course, is being prompted by OPEC and the oil crisis. And at that point, he's thinking, in the next slide, you'll see why it's so obvious, or seems so obvious to somebody in the late 1970s, but that energy systems are used up as energy becomes scarce and then replaced by other types. And so he sees this as a series of a series of replacements. Now, if you look at more recently in 2008, the last 200 years of energy history, you can see that it really does look like a cascading system of energy transitions that have come to sort of define modern epochs. So the dotted line there is late 1970s when Marchetti was writing, and you kind of see that biomass has obviously declined. The age of coal rose and then fell. It's becoming more narrow at that point. Petroleum, crude oil is replacing it, and even natural gas is picking up. So it's easy to see how at that point that's what it did look like. But I investigated from the Canadian perspective in the north, and to see these kinds of interpretations made it into all kinds of Canadian texts, including Historical Atlas of Canada, where the idea is that there was a transition from firewood to coal. And so when I look at bigger questions of energy consumption and production, I start with biomass energy in the form of firewood. And that paper came out in this chapter called Hewers of Wood, A History of Wood Energy in Canada, in Ruth Sandwell's book, Powering Up Canada, which is on the table over there. And this looks at specifically the sort of larger energy history of firewood in Canada. Most people think of it like this, as a sort of individual enterprise. Wood is cut down and dried in the forest, brought home in lengths, and over again. This is about half of a cord. Shown here, a cord is the standard measurement of wood for most of this period. And it's, of course, hauled home, and Doug McCallum mentioned the centrality of animals. Animals were essential for this system. But this system actually is the one that most of our estimates of energy history were based on, including these kinds of maps. This is one I produced, but it's similar to the Historical Atlas of Canada. And this shows kind of where the geography of energy, biomass energy was. You can see the importance in the Montreal plain. I don't have the labels on this one, but the Montreal area here has already used up a lot of its firewood, but the sort of farther off areas of the Montreal plain are still major producers. And then down in southwestern Ontario, major production there as well. Partly related to settlement and the clearing of forests, but mostly related to the markets that were provided in Detroit from the southwestern counties of Ontario. So energy is being produced here for biomass, or for firewood, and then 30 years later, not 20 years later, 1891, we've got a bit of a shift, actually. So at this point, the lakefront areas of Ontario have declined in terms of its total production, and it's moved back into the uplands. And this is partly because, into the Canadian Shield. This is partly because population is, of course, increasing in those urban areas and lakefront areas rapidly. But it's also because of a different source of supply that doesn't really get caught in the census, and that is these kinds of suppliers. The business of biomass was, in the early period, an urban utility. This was most of the coal producers. This is the original Rogers Centre here in Toronto. Not the sports arena, but the one owned by Elias Rogers, Ted's uncle. So it's the waterfront down on the Esplanade, where you can see in the foreground, most of these companies were called coal companies, but if you look carefully, you can see rows and rows and rows of firewood all down here along as the waterfront gets filled in. Those are kind of filled with firewood for storage as well. And based on estimates of what they actually used and sold in a year, there was not enough space available here for a fraction of it, for much of a fraction of it, so they were replenishing these supplies weekly and selling it throughout the city. This is in 1894. A little bit earlier here, there's one company that was buying it and building a light rail for it, the Toronto Grey and Bruce rail line, was bringing firewood to the city. You can see the red dots, those are on the bottom right, those are the consumers, and the green dots are the stations where the railroad picked it up in the early 1870s. This is the George Laidlaw project. And then there it is distributed throughout the city, and the financial district and distillery district might well have been called the energy district or Biomass in that period, where all of these retailers are buying it and then reselling it to consumers throughout the city. In Montreal, a similar story exists, except in Montreal it continues much longer. And Quebec is a major furnace as far as this country's history is concerned, and it continues burning firewood well into the mid-20th century. This is in 1929, and you can see the green dots are locations that still list firewood for sale, and black or gray listing coal. And so coal and wood dealers are very common throughout most of urban Canada, and that really drives a different kind of production that I show. Really, that I show in that chapter are not spoken for in the record, the historical records. If you look at the bottom green line here, this is the census data in Stewart's 1978 kind of history of this early history of the displacement of the energy source. It's quite low, and it's immediately replaced by coal, which is the black line. So coal, there's that transitional moment right there in the late 1890s. The transitional moment when at least what is being reported in the census is replaced or displaced by coal. Now, Unger and Thistle's new book on energy history in Canada has actually bumped that up a bit, but argue that it doesn't take into account from a consumption side all of the sources available. And so my new estimate, which I explain in that book, is actually much higher and shows that the displacement of coal doesn't actually happen until quite a bit later, and that firewood doesn't decline, but more importantly, I consider it more of a baseline energy that remains consistent throughout Canadian history right into the mid-20th century. And so you can think of all of the urban transportation systems, the rural animals and people who were spending so many of their hours producing this material. All right, so that was one look at energy. And energy, of course, comes in multiple forms. How do I go back on this? There's no keyboard. There we go. Energy is, of course, produced in multiple forms. And when I think of the farm as an agri-ecosystem and trying to look at this integrated approach to it, I want to be able to look at the multiple forms of traditional energy carriers, including the muscle. So the muscle that Smill says was displaced, human muscle, animal muscle. When did that? How was that fueled in this early period? And so, in this book that I published last year with McGill-Queens University Press, it's an edited collection of the environmental history of Prince Edward Island. My chapter is on agriculture. There's another chapter on other energy, but it's the modern type. My chapter on energy encountered a problem, or brought me up against a problem that I'm really trying to explain in this second project. The problem is here's the island, the province, and the three counties, which we're going to look at in a minute. But the problem is this one right here. In 1871, and again in 1881, in the province, if we count up the number of animals that existed in this mixed agriculture economy, we see that the fodder crops that were reported in the census were actually not nearly enough to support the animals that existed. So there was actually a major shortage of feed required for the animals that these businesses were trying to produce. And so my question was, how did they deal with that issue? And in the book, I've only looked at one possible solution. And it's kind of multi-part. You can see in the central part of the island there in Queens County around the town of Charlottetown, these animals did have enough to eat. The dotted lines surrounding a couple counties are actually other kinds of root crops that were being produced, especially turnips. So there were multiple crops being produced for animals, but in that central part of the province there was enough. It's the outer parts that I'm trying to account for at this point. And I argue that there was some inter-regional trade that helped account for that, but that essentially the central part of the island was more of a concentrated animal feed system, if you think of that in its early forms. So one of the big issues, though, is producing enough of this stuff, the green hay for the animals. And one of the solutions that they came up with was a very local, very regional maritime solution for this, and that was the dredging of the harbors and the rivers for this fertilizer, an organic fertilizer called mussel mud. Now, maritimers refer to it as mussel mud, but it's essentially an oyster. It's a mixture of oyster shells. And by extracting that from the rivers and spreading it on the land, which happened mostly in the areas in blue, not across the island uniformly, but mostly in the areas in blue initially, they were able to increase the productivity of especially their haylands. So those areas were actually the ones that had kind of figured out what they needed for this production. But then later, the Prince Edward Island rail line is built. It opens first in 1871, and then it's carrying this mud on trains like the Mud Special across the island. And the production continues and actually makes hay more feasible. So the next project that I am working on now, I'm just going to skip ahead here, is to look at how they were able to produce that. Here's the process of digging mussel mud and spreading it on the land. But really this was just one example of a kind of intensification of agriculture. And I look at one farm in particular, and that's the farm of, not advancing here, the farm of Roderick Munn. Sorry, this was the image that shows the digging of mussel mud. It's a very romanticized portrait, and in reality it looks more like this photograph where there were dozens and even hundreds sometimes people gathered around and buying this stuff for a price from people who did this commercially in the bays. But one of those people was Roderick Munn. Now, he left a farm in the eastern part of the province in 1880, had enough capital to buy this mostly cleared farm. It was a semi-improved farm with about 60% of the land cleared. It was a 100-acre, completely average, 100-acre lot. And what you see here in this image is at the height of its production in the 1930s or 40s. There's no date for it, but when the Munn farm started and when he took it over in 1880, there was no farmhouse, so he immediately set to building one, taking out a loan, and starting to expand the land. And one of the first things he did was start to haul, again, this mussel mud from the bays. But that was just one of the crop improvements that he was doing. You can see in the dark black line how much mud he was spreading, and then in the dotted line that follows, the increase of hay that follows. So he was spreading it on his hay fields in particular. And if we break down, this chart here just shows Munn's farm from a human labor standpoint. So how much labor did he have to put into his land? It's very clear that the reason he moved to this area was not just for access to this kind of fertilizer, but the timing of it was based around his family. So his first son, to reach the age of 15, he reached 15 in 1879. And then other sons grew up. He had 6 kids when he made this move, 3 sons, 3 daughters. And their labor force continues to expand. Unfortunately, he had trouble keeping them on the farm. They wanted to leave. So really, as soon as one son turned 15, another son would leave. And then the daughters actually, here at the end, it's mostly daughters who are on the farm with him, but they're getting married and leaving. And actually all 5 of them leave, and only 1 child stays. The rest are actually off the island. So this is part of a common maritime history of out-migration. So even in this well-off farm of a well-organized system, we see people leaving. But in that period, we see that he actually increases his energy output from the land in terms of food in a dramatic way. But the one thing I'm focused on here is particularly what he was growing for animals, not for human energy, but for animals. And the wheat and oats are the green and red at the bottom. And they don't really go up in any significant way, but what does is hay, turnips, and potatoes, which could be fed to animals, but were usually sold commercially. But in particular, his fodder crop, that giant blue, the increase of blue output. So this is all normalized in terms of calories. All of these crops are listed in terms of gigajoules. So if we look at his total output from the land and say that there's much more than just crops that are being produced here. In purple, we see firewood. This is the energy that comes off the land in terms of firewood. In green, it's the pastures that's expanding, as you can see, to feed the animals. And actually, all of the previous slide is encompassed in the blue area at the bottom now. So he's growing and expanding the farm and its ability to especially feed animals. Now, I don't actually know that much about his animals, but I know that he's actually tailoring his cropland choices in order to satisfy them. So I want to end with a look at the management problems that this introduced, and to think about the efficiency of the decisions that are being made here. So going back to Václav Smil, who actually started his career in a similar kind of research. Oh, I keep clicking on the wrong slide. I think that it's going to, yeah. Going back to Smil, who in 1983 was working on a similar project, a lot of ecologists and other scientists were responding to the energy crisis of the 1970s and saying, well, what's happening in agriculture? We're seeing a great increase of productivity, that is the output per unit of labor, but is it actually an output in returns on investment from an energy standpoint? So here's an early model that was being used by Smil to say 1 acre of corn can produce the line that goes off to the side, a certain amount of corn, but at what cost? And so he looks at all these energy inputs. Now, I'm not going to have time to go through my entire model, but we basically are using the same kind of idea with the Sustainable Farm Systems project, except we're doing it in a circular way. So we're not just considering what's coming out of the land. I won't go into what all the acronyms mean here, but basically the production at the bottom is the produce of the land. But we take into consideration this important internal circular loop, okay? So there's the internal exchange of biomass in this case that's going back to feed animals and actually put new crops on the land. And as you can see from what happened on the Munn farm, he's growing more hay, using all of the extra labor of clearing new land, of hauling muscle mud, and of producing more fodder crops so that he can have more animals. And one of the big questions in sustainability research, right, is what kind of food is the most efficient to grow, and what kind of agriculture is the most sustainable to produce. And this does go back to the energy crisis, because so much of those items that are being used to produce the 1 acre of corn, or in this case a gigajoule of output, is this top line here, which is all of the external inputs, that make a agri-ecosystem work. And so I'm basically just going to show what happens in Prince Edward Island now if we look at each of the 3 counties. Let me see if I can, does this? I thought I was in presenter mode, but I am not, so. All right, so if we think of the farms themselves as the farms and the people and the societies that they're feeding as everything within this red circle here, what's actually coming off the land itself? And in areas where animals are highly concentrated and where feed has to be brought in from outside, other members of our teams, that we're part of a group called Sustainable Farm Systems, and there's other people doing the exact same model with different parts of the Western world. And the first group to run this came up with this result, right? So there's a massive input of external energy. And this is because this part is actually in Catalonia, and it's a concentrated animal center, especially with swine, and the grain that's brought in from outside to feed them causes an imbalance in this system, right? So there's a decrease of what it loops around internally here, and an increase of external inputs. And so that is sort of what they pointed out as a sort of unsustainable system initially. But when we look at a place like Prince Edward Island, I'm just going to show 3 back and forths here. So this is 1880, and we do 2 other time points, but I'm not going to get into those. It's going to be 1880 and 1996, the last time point that we look at. It's going to be for the 3 counties. So Prince County has a very small amount of external energy being brought in, right? So they're not bringing in anything outside, and even labor, the human labor, is such a small amount of energy input here that it barely registers in the system. But their outputs are mostly crops and products of the forest. They're all being shown together here at the bottom. So you can see it's changed from 1880 to 1996 is that it produces a lot more output. It starts to recycle more actual biomass internally, and it brings in some more external outputs, but it's nothing like the feedlot system that we saw in Valles in Catalonia. Moving east, and that's partly because of potato production, especially in Prince County. Moving east into a much more mixed agri-ecosystem, we see Queens County, which is the center part of the island. It goes from, again, a very small amount of external to a large amount of output, but actually much more of it is being recycled internally. And that's because this is a mixed ecosystem that continues right up until the late 20th century. The role of animals has always been very important in that part of the island. And then finally, Kings County, which is the easternmost county. This is where Munn left. Okay, so Munn left Kings County to come to the center part, to Queens County. And what we see here is a big shift, not really an output and not an input, but you see actually a decrease in internal recycled energy. And that's because the number of livestock in that system starts to decrease. So you actually see three different systems changing in the island's agriculture. And I argue that by looking at different scales, the farm level, the county level, and then the whole province level, and it helps that this is a bounded system, this is an island, it's actually much easier to find imports and exports when it's an island system like that. By looking at multiple levels, we can test some of these measures of sustainability. We can look how energy is managed both by individual businesses like farms, and then by how it occurs at the province-wide level. I don't have time to go into some of the details about how we create the energy estimates for each one of these outputs and inputs, but suffice to say it's a work in progress, and this would be basically the food contribution to a larger chapter that looks at muscle, animal power, biomass energy in country and cities, and some water and wind as well. So this is the one chapter or one approach to looking at the whole energy system and what I hope will be an integrated system of energy history in Canada without, before, and even during the time of fossil fuels. So I think that's it. All right, thank you. I can't take it.